Hi, so this is a video I've wanted to make for a while, and I've just rounded up season four, so I think that it's good timing. Um, who am I aiming this video at? I'm aiming at people who have access to Netflix, because obviously if you don't, you can't watch it. I know how annoying it was for me when I didn't have access to Netflix and people were recommending things, so saying that as a disclaimer. Um, and perhaps people who've already watched the dramatization, and this is kind of sharing my take on it. Maybe people would agree or disagree. Um, yeah. So a little bit of background. My sister-in-law very kindly set me up with a Netflix account. I had been a little bit skeptical of Netflix. Never the content. I'd never questioned the content. I actually think Netflix has very good content. At least some of it's very good from what I've seen. Sure, there's a bit of wokeism there. There's a bit of that going on, but it also has some very good productions. And I've seen a few other things. I have mostly been watching The Crown, but I've watched other things as well. I've watched films. I watched The Outlaw King recently about Robert the Bruce. That was pretty good. And yeah, that's how I got onto it. So I'm one of these people that kind of benefits from someone else's generosity. So I'm forever grateful to my sister-in-law and brother for setting an account up for me in their name. Little bit of background to this show. Its creative director is its writer, I should say, Peter Morgan. Now, this man has done perhaps more than anyone else in Britain to popularise the Windsor dynasty on screen and on stage. He is also the creator of The Queen. He was behind The Queen, starring Helen Mirren and Michael Sheen, which was a critically acclaimed 2006 film depicting that awful week in September 1997 when Diana died. Um, he also wrote I Understand the Audience, documenting the Queen's meetings with her prime ministers. And I didn't even know that until recently. I've just done a bit of research. So, um, what I won't do here is go into very deep background information about the Crown because there's just so much to say, and I'll inevitably overlook something. But to summarize, the series documents the lives, loves, and stories around senior members of the royal family, and particularly the Queen, from her accession in 1952 up to the 21st century. Morgan's a bit vague about where exactly it will cut off. There are still two more seasons to go, which will cover the period from the 1990s into the 21st century. Very broadly speaking, each series roughly corresponds with a decade, but each season, to use Americanism, roughly corresponds with a decade, but that's not precise. Um, and there are some of the characters that have more of a presence than others, inevitably senior members of the royal family. But anyone who thinks that this would just be like a kind of royal soap opera, it's a lot more than that. I would describe The Crown as a real insight into late 20th century British and even partially world history. Um, it's superb. I honestly can't praise it highly enough, and I think it deserves all the acclaim it gets. Now, ultimately, it is just a dramatization, it isn't a documentary series. However, I think that, notwithstanding some question marks, I think generally the research is pretty good. Um, I've seen a lot of episodes where I think, nah, that has to be artistic license. They must have exaggerated that. I look it up afterwards, and right enough, it really happened. So that's interesting. The Windsor family, the British royal family, are probably the most famous family in the world. So, as the subject matter, it is a very compelling one. Um, it certainly has, I think, reiterated interest in our monarchy, which support remains still in favour of, although it does go up and down over time. But generally, the British are still pro monarchy. That hasn't changed, even with any recent events. Um, the indication is that there's no sudden rush for this to change. Um, although I think there will be constitutional questions around the monarchy in the near future, but that's for another video. So, I just want to briefly outline some of the cast. Superb acting, very well chosen cast. Claire Foy, who some people might know from First Man as Neil Armstrong's wife, plays the Queen, and she was absolutely superb at capturing that the young Queen Elizabeth II. It kind of goes from the death of her father, King George VI, played by Jared Harris, and it goes from the very first episode when she was told, when her and Philip, played by Matt Smith of Doctor Who fame, were on a trip to Kenya, and she was told that she basically ascended the throne. Of course, the coronation came a good time afterwards, and the reason for that, actually, British royal coronations, the reason they don't come right on top of the death of a monarch is because the new king or queen has to have a period of mourning. After all, an ascension is a sad thing for them. It's the death of their parent. So there needs to be that mourning period, but also it's a huge event. There's a lot to organise. The first season of The Crown really focused a lot on the relationship between the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, which in those early years were led to believe was quite rocky, not always stable. With his recent passing, and the actors who played him, Matt Smith and Tobias Menzies, um, have, there's been a lot of reflections on the Duke's life. He was a complex man, actually, and I think The Crown does reiterate that, or underline that rather. Um, but that first season really looked at some of the struggles in the marriage, the royal tour of Australia, his ties to the Navy, his difficulties at Gordonstoun, which were then passed on to Charles, and for the Queen, her challenges in really moulding into a role that she never asked for. Um, and that you could see that sort of Peter Morgan touch coming in because he reiterated that in his portrayal of the monarch in The Queen. The interesting thing about The Queen, the film The Queen, was although the subject focus was the death of Diana, it actually had a lot more to do with the Queen and Tony Blair. I mean, there was no actress playing Diana in that film, so I think there's some of the way that Morgan sees the Queen come through in that first series of The Crown, as with the film The Queen. You can see some echoes of that. Um, Obviously different times in her life, but in terms of his, I get the impression Morgan's sympathetic to the Queen. I get the impression he wants to really show that this was a young woman who never asked for the role, yet she really, really did rise to the challenge. Um, it's one thing that critics of the Queen forget. This was a role she never wanted, and for almost 70 years, she has been arguably a perfect constitutional monarch. So that first season also focuses on the relationship with her prime ministers, particularly Churchill, played by John Lithgow, who was once in a film called Then There Were Giants, in which he played Roosevelt opposite Bob Hoskins' Churchill. Lithgow was great at the role, um, and then it went into the Eden and Macmillan years, the Suez Crisis and the Profumo scandal under Harold Macmillan. And I like the way it does that. This isn't just a stuffy or overly cliched kind of soap opera about the lives of the royal family. It really gets into the political side as well, her relations with her prime ministers, which of course is extremely important. And then in the second season, it gets into Harold Wilson's era. Um, so that's getting into the 60s. Um, There is a great scene in that first season. It might be my favorite scene, actually, favorite episode, where she is feeling a bit jealous, or one is left to feel that she is a bit jealous of Jackie Kennedy, the glamour and the romance. But there's actually some tensions with the Kennedy visit, and this is true to history. Um, so at the time, Ghana was gaining its independence. This was, of course, in the decolonization era of the late 50s and early 60s. And there's a great scene where she meets Kwame Nkrumah, of course, Ghana's founding father, in a dance floor in Accra. And you wonder what's going on here. And they start dancing. So this was, I thought it was a great scene, and it really happened. I thought, nah, that has to be an exaggeration. Look it up, and it really happened. That's the great thing about The Crown. The source material really does lend itself to that. And yet, all this stuff, or a lot of it, really did happen. Another big focus in that first series is tensions between the Queen and her sister. They were close as siblings, but due to constitutional barriers and due to the church's opposition, Princess Margaret, played in the first season by, if you just bear with me, Vanessa Kirby, could not marry the man she loved, Group Captain Peter Townsend, played by, I think it was Ben Miles. And there's quite a lot of focus on the Queen and Margaret's tensions over that. And Margaret, of course, is seen as a bit of a wild child. She was very glamorous, or more like a Hollywood star than a member of the royal family. Um, so that's the first season. The second season, still with Claire Foy, um, it focuses on an episode which is quite significant. Don Grigg, a Tory peer and newspaper editor, who wrote quite a scathing article about the Queen being like a priggish schoolgirl. And it showed that although we had a constitutional monarchy, there was still a sort of the idea of criticizing the royals at that time was still very taboo. Um, and man actually assaulted Greg um, outside his television appearance. So that focuses on that, and there's a great scene where he's kind of come to the palace to kind of explain what he thinks needs to be reformed, or because he'd been called to a meeting and he thought he was going to meet senior courtiers, and then the Queen herself comes in. It's a great scene. But John Gregg, along with Malcolm Muggeridge, arguably forced the monarchy to reform. So it's interesting that initially it would have been seen as an insult, but in the long term, their intervention actually helped the monarchy. Um, there's an episode focusing on the Great Smog of 1952. So really, this is not, obviously it's about the royal family, but it really does bring in social history as well, and a lot of the significance around that. So season three, we get into the 1960s, and the big change there was a changing in the cast. So Olivia Colman, who I knew from The Favourite, in which she depicted Queen Anne, picked over from Claire Foy. That was a bit controversial because Claire Foy was very popular. But I think Olivia Colman was great. And realistically, you can't have a middle aged queen played by a younger woman. Of course, you could have makeup and so on, but I think that was the right call. Um, and Tobias Menzies takes over from Matt Smith as the Duke of Edinburgh. Some significant episodes in that season. I mentioned the that was in season two. Actually, I was going to say the Kennedy visit. Aberfan. So the Aberfan disaster in Wales. That was one of the most moving episodes of all the 40 that I've seen. It was very, very powerful, and it showed the Queen has been quite out of touch. So this series doesn't idolize the royal family. It isn't uncritical. Um, but that was a very powerful scene. Very, very sad about the Aberfan disaster and how Harold Wilson and others really pushing the Queen to be a bit more, maybe make a visit. And it had captions at the end, and it doesn't do this with every episode. But to this day, people in her inner circle say it's her biggest regret not immediately responding to that disaster because it made her appear cold and out of touch. But that was a very moving episode. Another memorable episode in that season was the visit by the Apollo 11 astronauts and Prince Philip going through something of a midlife crisis and kind of really looking up to the Apollo 11 astronauts and then feeling deflated when he found them to be really ordinary men, and he was expecting them to be maybe great philosophers or something like that. So this series really does explore psychology, and it really is much more than a period drama, in my opinion. Um, but the set designs are exquisite. The period, the vehicles, the costumes. You could tell the production costs really, really went into that. Um, Also, by season three, we're starting to see more of Charles and Anne. Charles played by Josh O'Connor, and Anne played by Erin Doherty. Um, there's an episode called Gold Stick. I believe it was the last. It was either the last episode of season three or the first episode of season four, and it covers the assassination of Lord Mountbatten by the IRA. I should also say there's a lot of focus on the tensions with the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, played by Derek Jacobi, and earlier by the same actor who actually played Prince Charles in The Queen, Alex Jennings. But there's quite a big focus on that because the abdication had a very, very profound effect on the Windsor dynasty. And of course, without that abdication, there would be no Queen Elizabeth II. Anyway, so season three gets into the 70s, it gets into the Jubilee, and a lot of things going on then. Princess Margaret's mental health problems, her alcoholism, her relationship issues, and starting to get more focus on Charles and Diana. Excuse me, Charles and Anne. Then we get into season four, which arguably is the most emotive to date in terms of the family. And that a big focus of that season is Charles and Diana. I think it's the episode actually Goldstick where Charles first meets Diana, and there's a particular piece of music that's used throughout in a lot of the Diana scenes. And I don't know what it's called. It's just called the Diana theme, but it's with a harp, and it's very haunting, very beautiful. If you type it into YouTube, the Crown Diana theme, it comes up. It really, really suits the story of her life. For someone as important as Diana, of course, that would have been pressurizing for anyone to fill. But the young actress who plays her, Emma Corrin, is superb. Josh O'Connor is also very good as Prince Charles. But emulating someone as iconic as Princess Diana is no easy task. And I think she is really has been superb. To get the voice just right, the mannerisms just right. Um, so a big theme of season four is that relationship between Charles and Diana and its inevitable collapse. So sad, there's definitely a sad overtone to it, but very powerful acting. A good episode is Terra Nullius, which is about their visit to Australia and some of the tensions that were coming through. That was a very powerful episode. Exquisite set design. It showed the popularity of Diana. It showed the tensions with Charles. He was getting jealous of his wife. Um, Bob Hawke, the Australian Prime Minister, and his pitch to republicanism. It just covers everything. Um, and there's a very sad episode. It's called Avalanche. And again, disclaimer here if anyone hasn't seen it, but it kind of starts off with for Charles's 37th birthday, they go to the West End, and Diana puts on the stance. She kind of makes excuses like she's going to use the ladies, and she basically dances to Billy Joel's Uptown Girl with the Dance Away in Sleep. And Charles is mortified. He doesn't like this sort of public display. So later in the episode, she kind of makes up to him. So for an anniversary present, he makes this private VHS video in which he's singing a song from Phantom of the Opera. And again, you think that must be artistic license. You look it up, and it really happened. No, that's not to say the conversations went down as they did in the program, but she really did dance to Uptown Girl, and she really did make that private video, apparently. Um, but it's profoundly sad to see it collapse. Now, to be fair to Charles and Camilla, Camilla's played by an actress called, she's got an interesting name, Ferrell, Emerald Fennell, yeah. Um, Also, I should say by the 70s, late 70s, so early season four, Gillian Anderson comes in as the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Um, and I know her, of course, as Agent Scully in the X Files. Superb as Thatcher. The episode Balmoral is interesting. It shows the beginning of tensions between the Queen and Thatcher, and there's another episode on the differences over sanctions on South Africa. So season four is largely about Charles and Diana, but it's not totally dominated by them. There's an episode in which I think it's called the Hereditary Principle, in which Princess Margaret finds out the shocking secret that the Queen Mother's cousins had suffered severe learning difficulties, and they were basically kept in a sort of institution. And this is kind of a secret of that side of the family. Quite shocking. And they only died recently. Well, one of the sisters died in, I think it was 2016, the other in the mid 80s. But that was quite a sad episode because it showed that this is a family that definitely has skeletons. There's no getting away from it. It does. Um, but the particularly Terra and Nullius, when there's a scene where Charles and Diana actually make up, and you do get the impression Charles is going to distance from Camilla. Of course, we know history. Um, and it also depicts their first scene meeting ever, which might not be true. Apparently, they actually met at a polo match, but it shows the young Diana. I mean, she was 18, but she seemed a lot younger, like 13, dressed up as part of the play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And they kind of discuss how they both like it. And uh, she's very childlike, and Charles is intrigued. And he was dating her older sister at the time, but that didn't work out. And the older sister of Diana actually played Cupid a little bit. But it's the whole Charles Diana taking the crown. It's so sad and so well done, in my opinion. One of the most moving bits for me was when she visited New York City. And again, this is true, 1989, you could see the archive footage of this. And she visited an AIDS hospital or a hospital dealing with AIDS. And again, Emma Corrin really captured that when she spontaneously hugged a little boy who had AIDS. And it's just a very moving series, in my opinion. Of course, it's a dramatization, it's not a documentary, and that's something people need to be constantly aware of. It's not a documentary. So that's perhaps a negative side effect that people might look at particularly powerful scenes, particularly the acting of Josh O'Connor and Erin, excuse me, Emma Corrin, and take that to heart that that is actually directly what happened. Charles doesn't come across well, um, because earlier in the program you do feel quite sorry for him because of the bullying he faced at Gordonston. Ironically, so did his father, although his father insisted that he go there. Um, and you feel quite sorry for Charles. There's another episode I forgot. I'll just mention briefly. When Charles was given his investiture as Prince of Wales, and his tutor was actually the deputy leader of Plaid Cymru, quite a Welsh nationalist. That was a very good episode, very revealing about Charles the man. But to see the sort of rise and breakdown of Charles and Diana's relationship, particularly the last episode, it's just entitled War, very sad. And it's sad in real life that that never worked out because I still believe that in the early 80s, early in the marriage, there was some genuine affection there. But it would be unfortunate if the Crown kind of. I've seen people saying they love the fact that the Crown has encouraged a whole new generation to hate Charles and Camilla. That's unfair. It is ultimately a dramatization, not a documentary. And what goes on in those arguments might not have been verbatim. There were two sides to it, but one is definitely left with the impression that Charles wasn't trying hard enough. Um, who knows? Who knows? But it's just a very powerful dramatization. And if you have access to Netflix and you like history, what I would underline here is you don't need to be a monarchist because it doesn't idolize the royal family. It doesn't say they're perfect. Quite the opposite. It shows them to be complex, multifaceted people. And I think that's one of its great strengths. Not a single character in this series is one dimensional. It's been very effective in that sense of humanizing them, both good and bad. It's not saying because they are our monarchy, because they are our royal family, let's just idolize them. It's quite critical at points. It depicts the snobbery, it depicts the stuffiness of royal life, particularly when the young Diana is totally isolated, and it doesn't shy away from her bulimia issues either. So it's just a very powerful series, and I'm looking forward to season 5 and season 6. I don't know how far it will go. There is some doubt that it will go as far as the marriages of the Duchess of Cambridge and the Duchess of Sussex into the royal family, and I doubt it will go as far as Meghan and Harry, because that will be quite touchy, being so recent. But it has taken a degree of courage, I think, for Peter Morgan and the others to come up with something that is so intimate and to do it in such a classy way. I mean, what you get from The Crown is it's sentimental and it's very intimate without being tacky, without being tactless either. I think it's very well done, and I honestly I think it's for me it's the best period drama I've ever seen, and I've seen quite a few. But my only thing with Netflix is I kind of wish this was more commercially available. I mean, I'm lucky because of the generosity of my brother and my sister-in-law, but a lot of people won't be able to see The Crown, and I think that's a great pity. Apparently, The Crown and other Netflix productions ratings have been dropping as lockdown eases and less people are staying at home. But I think that that's one issue with Netflix. In the end of the day, it's a paid streaming service. It's not Freeview. That does put a barrier on a potential audience. So, and I appreciate they need to make the revenue somehow, but I don't know. As a business model, I'm not sure how long it can survive. But anyway, if you haven't seen it, do check out The Crown, and you need to watch it in order. It's not exactly chronological. I mean, it's like you could probably miss one episode and go on to the next and then catch up, but it's broadly chronological, so it is better to watch it in order. I mean, each episode is different. There's no like part one and part two. It's each episode is unique. But check it out. I just think it's superb. The Crown by Peter Morgan.